you ever wondered how indigenous tribes manage to preserve meat without refrigeration, even in the harshest environments? While we rely on fridges and freezers to keep our food fresh, these tribes have been using ancient techniques for centuries to keep their meat safe and edible. No electricity required. How do they do it, and what secrets have they mastered that we've long forgotten? Here are the 15 ways tribes preserve meat without refrigeration. 1. Smoking. Smoking is one of the oldest preservation techniques, particularly useful in humid environments where drying alone is not effective. African tribes such as the Zulu of South Africa and the Hausa of Nigeria have long relied on this method to keep their meat safe for consumption over long periods. Freshly slaughtered meat is cut into thin strips or large chunks before being seasoned with salt and local spices. Once prepared, it is hung on racks above a controlled fire made from hardwood, producing thick smoke without an open flame. The smoke slowly dries the meat while the compounds released from the burning wood act as a natural preservative, preventing bacterial growth and enhancing the meat's rich, smoky flavour. The process can take hours or even days, depending on the thickness of the meat and the climate. The end result is a deep-coloured, flavourful meat that can be stored for months in a dry place. In many African communities, smoked meat is often rehydrated in stews or eaten as a snack, a taste reminiscent of home and tradition. 2. Salt curing. Walking along the coast of East Africa, one might come across villagers diligently preparing fresh cuts of meat, layering them with salt under the blazing sun. Salt curing is another ancient technique used across Africa, especially by coastal tribes such as the Swahili of East Africa and the Berbers of North Africa. This method works by drawing moisture out of the meat, making it inhospitable for bacteria. First, the meat is carefully cleaned and excess fat is trimmed off to prevent spoilage. Generous amounts of salt are rubbed into every surface, ensuring complete coverage. In some cases, the meat is placed in clay or wooden containers and layered with even more salt, forming a thick, protective crust. Depending on the thickness, the curing process can take several days to weeks. Once the meat is properly cured, the excess salt is washed off, and it can be further dried or stored in a cool, dry place. Many African dishes, such as Nigeria's kilishi, incorporate salt-cured meat which, when rehydrated, bursts with intense, savoury flavours, carrying the essence of traditional food preservation. 3. Fat preservation. Now imagine the rolling plains of Kenya and Tanzania, where the Maasai people move with their herds, relying on every part of their livestock for sustenance. Fat preservation, also known as confit or meat encasement in fat, is a widely used technique by pastoralist tribes. This method not only preserves meat, but also provides a crucial source of energy, essential for nomadic lifestyles. To begin, the meat is cooked or dried to remove moisture before being submerged in rendered animal fat, often from the same animal. The fat solidifies around the meat, creating an airtight barrier that prevents spoilage. In many cases, the preserved meat is stored in earthenware pots or calabashes, kept in shaded or underground spaces to maintain a cool temperature. This method can keep meat fresh for months, if not longer. When needed, a piece is simply scooped out and either eaten as is or heated. The Maasai, for example, often mix preserved meat with milk or blood, creating a protein-rich meal that sustains them during long journeys across the savannah. 4. Fermentation. Stepping into the heart of West Africa, one might witness Fulani herders carefully preparing meat in a way that smells distinctively sour yet appetizing. Fermentation is a lesser-known but highly effective preservation technique practiced by tribes such as the Fulani and Somali communities. This method not only preserves meat, but also enhances its digestibility and nutritional value. The process begins with fresh meat being mixed with salt and local bacteria-rich substances such as sorghum or millet flour. The mixture is then stored in a controlled, warm environment, allowing beneficial bacteria to break down proteins and create an acidic environment that prevents spoilage. The fermentation process can take anywhere from a few days to several weeks, depending on local traditions. Once fermented, the meat can either be consumed as is or further dried for extended storage. Dishes like Sudanese shamut or Ethiopian kwanta are examples of fermented meat delicacies, valued for their unique, tangy flavours. These traditional methods not only extend the shelf life of meat, but also provide a cultural touch to African cuisine. 5. Clay sealing. In the arid landscapes of Namibia and Mali, where resources are scarce, the Himba and Dogon tribes have developed a fascinating preservation technique: clay sealing. Imagine watching meat being carefully wrapped in a thick layer of clay, a natural preservation method that has withstood the test of time. First, the meat is lightly dried or smoked to remove excess moisture. Then, it is completely encased in wet clay, ensuring that no air or insects can reach it. Once sealed, the clay-covered meat is placed in a shaded area to dry, forming a hardened shell that acts as a protective barrier against bacteria and pests. When it's time to eat, the hardened clay is cracked open, revealing the preserved meat inside. This method allows meat to remain edible for several months, making it an ideal technique for long-term storage in hot, dry climates. The process is as much about practicality as it is about tradition, passing down invaluable knowledge from one generation to the next. 6th, biltong. Biltong is a traditional African method for making jerky that has been used for centuries, particularly among South African tribes like the Zulu and Xhosa. This technique involves soaking strips of meat in vinegar before adding a blend of spices such as coriander, salt, and pepper. After marinating for several hours, the meat is hung in a well-ventilated area to dry naturally. The vinegar plays a crucial role in preventing bacterial growth by creating an acidic environment, while the spices enhance both the taste and preservation process. This technique ensures that the meat remains safe to eat for months, even in the hot and dry African climate. African tribes perfected this method long before refrigeration existed. To ensure proper drying, they often built wooden racks or used dedicated drying huts. These spaces protected the meat from rain, insects, and scavengers, while allowing consistent airflow. In some regions, people place the meat near a fire to add a smoky flavour and extend its shelf life. Once fully dried, biltong became an essential food source for travellers, hunters and warriors who needed a durable, high-energy food supply during long expeditions. This preservation method also allowed communities to store excess meat during hunting seasons and have a reliable protein source during scarce periods. The flavour and texture of biltong vary depending on the spices used and the drying method. Some tribes incorporated wild herbs and additional seasonings to create distinct regional variations. Biltong was also sometimes stored in clay pots or wrapped in leaves to protect it from humidity. Modern versions of biltong remain popular across Africa and beyond, showcasing the effectiveness and lasting appeal of this ancient preservation technique. 7. Vinegar or acidic fruit brining. Brining meat in vinegar or naturally acidic fruits is another preservation technique widely practiced by African tribes. This method takes advantage of the acidity in ingredients like lemons, limes, tamarinds, and even fermented fruit juices to prevent spoilage. The process involves soaking cuts of meat in a brine mixture made from water, salt, and the chosen acidic ingredient for several hours or even days. The acid in the brine helps kill bacteria, while the salt draws out moisture, reducing the chances of spoilage. After brining, the meat is either air-dried, smoked, or sometimes buried in cool, dry pits to slow bacterial growth. Some African communities, particularly in West Africa, favoured using tamarind paste or baobab fruit extract for brining, as these ingredients were readily available and provided a unique flavour. The acidic fruit not only preserves the meat, but also enhances its taste, giving it a tangy, slightly sour quality. This method was particularly useful for nomadic tribes who needed a reliable way to keep meat fresh during long journeys or seasonal migrations. In addition to preservation, brining added variety to traditional dishes. Once the meat was ready for consumption, it was often grilled or stewed, with the brining process giving it a tender texture and deep, rich flavour. Some communities even used fermented fruit paste as marinades, further extending the meat's shelf life while adding complexity to its taste. Vinegar and acidic fruit brining remained a crucial technique for African tribes that relied on meat as a dietary staple, ensuring they had a dependable food source even in harsh conditions. 8. Honey preservation. Honey has been valued for its natural preservative properties for thousands of years, and many African tribes use it to keep meat fresh. Honey is a powerful antimicrobial agent due to its high sugar concentration, which dehydrates bacteria and prevents spoilage. The antibacterial properties of honey, combined with its ability to draw out moisture, make it an effective way to store meat without refrigeration. To preserve meat with honey, tribes coat fresh cuts in a thick layer of honey before sealing them in clay pots or wrapping them in large leaves. The honey forms a protective barrier around the meat, preventing moisture from seeping in and bacteria from growing. Over time, the meat absorbs the sweet, caramel-like flavour of the honey, creating a unique taste that was particularly appreciated in regions where sugar was scarce. Some tribes enhanced this method by adding herbs and spices, such as cloves or cinnamon, which offered additional antibacterial benefits and improved the flavour profile of the preserved meat. In areas where salt was scarce, honey preservation became even more valuable, providing a natural alternative for extending the meat's usability. Stored in cool, dry places, honey-preserved meat could last for months or even years, making it an essential survival technique. This method was particularly favoured by communities in East and Central Africa, where honey was abundant due to thriving beekeeping traditions. Honey preservation also played a significant role in trade, as some tribes bartered honey-preserved meat for other essential goods like grains and textiles, further cementing its importance in African culinary history. 9. Meat powder. One of the most efficient ways to preserve meat without refrigeration is by turning it into a powdered form and mixing it with fat. African tribes have used this technique for generations, creating a long-lasting, high-energy food source that could sustain them for months. This method, similar to the Native American pemmican, was particularly useful for hunters and warriors who needed lightweight, durable food for long expeditions. To prepare this, fresh meat is cut into thin strips and sun-dried until it becomes brittle. Once completely dried, it is pounded into a fine powder using wooden mortars and pestles. This powder is then combined with rendered animal fat, forming a thick paste or solid blocks. The fat acts as a natural sealant, preventing air and moisture from reaching the meat, which helps extend its shelf life. Some variations included dried berries, ground nuts, or even spices to add extra nutrition and flavour. This preservation technique was widely used in West and Central Africa, where communities relied on it as a primary food source during long dry seasons. The powdered meat mixture could be rehydrated in soups or stews, making it an extremely practical and efficient way to store protein. Some tribes stored the mixture in hollowed-out gourds or animal skins, further protecting it from humidity and pests. This method not only provided sustenance, but also allowed African tribes to have a stable and transportable food supply in times of scarcity. 10. Thin slicing. Thin slicing is one of the simplest yet most effective ways to preserve meat. African tribes discovered that cutting meat into thin strips maximizes the surface area exposed to air and sun, allowing it to dry faster and reducing the chances of spoilage. This technique required minimal resources and was widely practiced in regions where long-term meat storage was essential for survival. Before drying, the slices are often lightly salted to draw out moisture and prevent bacterial growth. The meat is then placed on drying racks, spread over rocks, or hung from tree branches to ensure even exposure to the sun and air. Some tribes also smoked the slices over a slow-burning fire, which not only sped up the drying process, but also added a rich, smoky flavour that enhanced the taste. This method was particularly popular in the Sahel and Savannah regions, where the hot, dry climate made it an effective way to preserve large quantities of meat. Once dried, the meat could be stored for months and later rehydrated in soups or eaten as a snack. Hunters and warriors often carried dried meat with them as a portable and reliable food source. In some cases, dried meat was pounded into powder and mixed with grains to create a more substantial meal. The simplicity and effectiveness of this method ensured its widespread use across the African continent, demonstrating the ingenuity of traditional preservation techniques. 11th, pounding and sun-drying. The art of suya preparation among the Hausa and Fulani peoples of northern Nigeria represents one of Africa's most sophisticated meat preservation techniques, developed over countless generations. This method has become so integral to the culture that it has spawned its own class of specialized butchers, the Mai Suya, who are respected craftsmen within their communities. The process begins long before the actual preservation, with the careful selection of meat, typically beef or goat, that must meet specific criteria regarding age, cut and quality. The initial preparation phase is crucial and involves a complex series of steps that have been refined over centuries. The meat must first be trimmed of all excess fat, as the Hausa people have learned through experience that fat can turn rancid during the preservation process, potentially spoiling the entire batch. The trimming requires exceptional skill, as some fat must be retained to maintain flavour and prevent the meat from becoming too dry. The butchers use specially designed knives that are maintained with religious dedication, as the precision of the cut directly impacts the quality of the final product. The meat is then cut into long, thin strips, approximately 3 to 4 millimeters thick, in a process that requires incredible precision. The cutting technique is particularly fascinating, as it must be done against the grain of the meat at a specific angle, typically around 45 degrees, to ensure that the strips will maintain their structural integrity during the drying process, while remaining tender enough to eat. This cutting technique has been passed down through generations and requires years of apprenticeship to master. The pounding process itself is a marvel of traditional food science. Using wooden mallets made from specific hardwoods, often from the African mahogany tree, the meat is pounded in a rhythmic pattern that the Hausa people have found to be most effective. The pounding serves multiple purposes. It tenderizes the meat by breaking down tough muscle fibers, increases surface area for more efficient drying, and creates small indentations that will later hold the spice mixture more effectively. The intensity and duration of pounding vary depending on the type and age of the meat being preserved. The spice mixture used in suya preparation, known as yaji, is perhaps one of the most closely guarded secrets in West African cuisine. Each Mai Suya has their own proprietary blend, often inherited through family lines and modified over generations. The basic mixture typically includes ground peanuts, which serve as both spice and binding agent, ginger, garlic, dried chili peppers, and various local spices such as African nutmeg and grains of paradise. However, it's the precise proportion of these ingredients and the addition of secret elements that gives each maisuya their signature taste. The spices serve a dual purpose. They not only enhance flavour, but also contribute significantly to the preservation process through their natural antimicrobial properties. The actual drying process is equally complex and requires careful attention to environmental conditions. The meat strips, now pounded and spiced, are hung on specially constructed racks made from local materials. These racks are designed to maximise airflow while protecting the meat from dust and insects. The positioning of the racks is crucial. They must be placed where they will receive direct sunlight during the hottest parts of the day, while being protected from sudden rain showers that could spoil the entire batch. The drying time varies depending on climate conditions, but typically takes between 4 to 6 hours of direct sunlight. During this time, the maisuya must constantly monitor the meat, rotating the strips to ensure even drying and adjusting their position based on the sun's movement. The meat must reach a specific level of dryness. Too much moisture left in the meat can lead to spoilage, while over-drying can make the meat too tough to enjoy. This perfect balance is determined through years of experience and is often judged by touch and appearance rather than any specific measurements. 12th, wrapping in leaves. The Yoruba people of Nigeria's leaf wrapping technique is an extraordinary example of how traditional knowledge intersects with natural preservation methods. This technique, known locally as U-wrap meat, has evolved over centuries to become a sophisticated system that takes advantage of the natural properties of various leaves, particularly banana leaves, to create an effective preservation environment. The process begins with the careful selection of leaves, which is far more complex than it might initially appear. The Yoruba people recognize different types of banana leaves based on the age of the plant, the position of the leaf on the plant, and even the time of year the leaf was harvested. Young leaves are preferred for their flexibility and higher concentration of natural preservative compounds, but they must be harvested at specific times of the day, typically early morning, when these compounds are most concentrated. The leaves must be free from any damage or disease, as even small imperfections can compromise the preservation process. The preparation of the leaves involves a careful wilting process over fire, known as passing. This process requires considerable skill, as the leaves must be heated enough to become pliable and release their natural preservative compounds, but not so much that they become brittle or lose their beneficial properties. The heat treatment also serves to sterilize the leaves, reducing the risk of contamination. The Yoruba have developed specific techniques for this process, including holding the leaves at particular angles over the fire and recognizing the exact moment when the leaf has been sufficiently treated by its change in color and texture. The meat preparation phase is equally important and involves specific cutting techniques that the Yoruba have found to be most effective for this preservation method. The meat is typically cut into uniform pieces, with the size and thickness determined by factors such as the type of meat, the intended storage duration, and even the season of the year. Before wrapping, the meat is seasoned with a traditional spice mixture that includes not only flavouring agents, but also natural preservatives such as African blue basil, bitter leaf, and scent leaf. The wrapping technique itself is a complex process that involves multiple layers, each serving a specific purpose. The first layer, which comes in direct contact with the meat, must be wrapped extremely tight to eliminate any air pockets that could lead to spoilage. This inner wrapping requires a specific folding pattern that has been perfected over generations. The second layer is wrapped in a different direction to provide additional protection and ensure that the package remains sealed. A third layer is often added for structural support and additional protection against environmental factors. The wrap packages are then subjected to a brief smoking process, which serves multiple purposes. The smoke helps to seal the leaf packages while also imparting additional preservative compounds to both the leaves and the meat within. The Yoruba people use specific types of wood for this smoking process, chosen for their ability to impart both preservative qualities and desired flavours without overwhelming the natural taste of the meat. The final stage involves storing the wrap packages in a specific manner. They are typically hung from rafters in a way that allows air circulation while protecting them from direct sunlight and pests. The packages are regularly checked and rotated to ensure even preservation, with experienced community members able to determine the condition of the meat simply by the smell and feel of the leaf package. 13. Tanning the meat. The Maasai people's Olmurum technique represents one of Africa's most sophisticated approaches to meat preservation, combining principles of leather tanning with food preservation. This method has evolved over centuries of pastoral life, where the need to preserve meat during long migrations and dry seasons necessitated innovative preservation techniques. The process is so specialised that specific families within Maasai communities are known for their expertise in this preservation method, with the knowledge being carefully passed down through generations. The preparation begins with a highly specialised cutting technique that requires exceptional skill and years of practice. The meat must be cut into sheets so thin that they become nearly transparent when held up to sunlight, a technique called osiget by the Maasai. This cutting process requires not only incredible precision, but also specific tools, traditionally made from locally sourced materials. The knives used for this purpose are specially crafted and maintained with specific angles and sharpening techniques that have been refined over generations. The cutting must be done in one continuous motion to ensure uniform thickness, as any variation could lead to uneven preservation. The tanning solution used in this process is a carefully guarded secret within Maasai communities, though we know it involves a complex mixture of bark extracts from several indigenous trees. The primary bark used comes from the African acacia tree, specifically selected for its high tannin content. The bark is harvested during specific seasons when the tannin concentration is highest, typically during the dry season when the tree's nutrients are most concentrated. The preparation of the tanning solution involves a precise process of crushing the bark, soaking it in water for specific periods, and filtering it multiple times to achieve the right concentration. The actual preservation process involves multiple stages of dipping the meat sheets into the tanning solution. Each dipping session must last for a precise amount of time. Too short, and the preservation won't be effective. Too long, and the meat becomes unpalatable. Between dipping sessions, the meat is stretched on specially constructed frames made from local hardwoods. These frames are designed to keep the meat sheets perfectly flat while allowing air circulation on both sides. The stretching process is crucial as it prevents the meat from shrinking and ensures even absorption of the tanning agents. During the drying phases, the position of the frames must be constantly adjusted to account for changes in wind direction and sun intensity. The Maasai have developed an intricate understanding of how environmental conditions affect the preservation process, and they often construct temporary shelters around the drying frames to protect them from sudden weather changes while maintaining optimal airflow. The entire process can take anywhere from 3 to 7 days, depending on weather conditions and the desired final texture of the meat.